Oh, welcome to a special episode of The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
And the reason we're recording this live on YouTube and is because of what's happening in Syria. As I'm sure you'll all be aware, major developments in Syria. We talked about this on the main podcast the other day. We're recording 2 p.m. UK time Sunday. So if you're listening or watching live, obviously you know that. For people who are logging in later, it's important to locate it because we don't know what is going to happen in the next few hours. What we do know is that in a matter of days, Bashar al-Assad has gone from being a dictator in a dictatorship that was broadly accepted and that people saw very little chance of it being upended, to now fleeing the country with his wife and close circle, doubtless hoping to have a life of wealthy exile somewhere, having stashed away tons of money from his kleptocracy. But they will be fearful because there's a massive outpouring going on, not just in Syria, but amongst Syrian exiles all around the world, which underlines the grip he has had, the sheer scale of brutality and oppression and the hatred he arouses. The rebels, who will now quite soon, I suspect, cease to be called rebels and will become at least part of a new Syrian government at some point, they've announced a curfew in Damascus starting 4 p.m. local time until 5 a.m. So amid the celebrations, obviously lots of fear. But Rory, you did a brilliant explainer about the history of this on the podcast last week. Do you want to just maybe sort of, briefly recap that, but also give us your take on what's going on now?
Yeah, thank you, Alastair. So to remind people, and thank you all for coming in live. Syria is a country that emerged from the end of the Ottoman Empire and these borders drawn between France and Britain in the Sykes-Picot Agreement after the First World War. And for longer than my lifetime, as you've pointed out, since 1971, it's been run by the dictatorship of the Assad family, first the father, and more recently the son. This government is and this is critical to what I'm about to say. It's an Alawite government, comes from a very particular religious sect, and the fundamental thing to understand about Syria is that it's more divided ethnically, religiously than almost any other place on earth. I mean, apart, I suppose, there are maybe a few other regions, but very few that compare. So there are Alawites and Druze, and for this I refer people to the excellent book by our friend Gerard Russell that looks at all these minority groups. But basically, the Alawites and Druze have the same relationship to Islam that Mormons have to Christianity. Very, very eccentric views. One lot believe you can be reincarnated as a plant, another lot believe you can only be reincarnated as a Druze, but normal Muslims don't believe that stuff. Then you've got about 16 different Christian groups. You've got big Sunni population, and then you've got different Shia populations. 12 Imam Shia, closely connected to the Iranian regime, but you've also got Ismailis who believe in 7 Imams, etc. Why am I saying all this? What I'm saying is that this regime was a minority regime from a minority religion holding together a very complicated country, and a country that had begun to split apart with a section up in the northwest, which were where the rebels centered. And the rebels originally had a sort of strong input of secular liberals, but increasingly dominated by Islamist groups, by al-Qaeda affiliates. Over on the east, a lot of Kurdish people. So the Kurdish nation, again, after the First World War, was basically split between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And there's a big chunk of them living on the Syrian side of the border who essentially dominate everything east of the Euphrates. You had the regime that was holding on to the major cities, and then you had the Arab groups in the south. And to fast forward, what's happened is, with everybody having sort of basically ignored this group for years, and we can talk a little bit about what the intelligence failure was, why we ignore these groups, it seems quietly under the radar, largely ignored by Western intelligence and other governments, to have been developing links with communities up and down and with the regime itself, which we can talk about a little bit more, allowing it in the space of just over a week to critically get to Damascus, the capital city, the center of power. and take back all the major population areas of the country. But the problem, and then I'm going to hand back to you, is that it's not like the Taliban. It's not done it alone. There are other bits which are involved in the armed resistance, which it's going to have to deal with. The Kurds that I've talked about, a lot of armed Kurds have advanced west. Some Arabs come up from Jordan, and something called the Syrian National Army that's backed by the Turks. So the new leader is dealing with a country with a very complicated religious sectarian history. He's dealing with a country whose economy is in bits. He's dealing with a country where there are 1.5 million people living in camps, where there are 5 or 6 million Syrian refugees overseas, and he's dealing with 4 different armed groups. Back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I said amidst all the celebration and the guns going off in the celebration, there will be an awful lot of uncertainty and anxiety. Let's just quickly maybe recap something about the Assads, because as you say, they've been in power. You're what? You're 51.
51, yeah. Born in 1973. Yeah.
Right. So they've been around for 53, 54 years as a ruling family. That is, just the father. Now, the father was a brute. He ran a brutal regime. His son took over, and I've met the younger Assad a few times, and he's actually, when you meet him, he's somebody who's very hard to find impressive.
Right.
He's very tall. He's about 6'2.5".
Mm-hmm.
He's got this sort of no chin thing. Literally, you talk about chinless wonder. He's a bit of a chinless wonder, and he's got very, very thin lips, quite a weak voice.
Right.
And yet he runs this kind of utterly brutal regime where torture and murder are just inbuilt into what they have done for many, many years with anybody who steps out of line. And of course, at the start, when he first took over in 2000, I think we always hope they're going to be better and more modern. And of course, they do the occasional thing that makes you think they will be. And of course, I think there was particular interest in Britain because of his wife, Asma. And
yes.
that's a really interesting story. She was born in London,
Yep.
Syrian parents, dad a doctor, a cardiologist, mother a diplomat.
Yep.
And when Hafez, the father, died,
Yep.
she there'd been no sense of, he died in the June, I think it was, there'd been no sense of the son having some sort of big relationship. And
Yep.
yet suddenly this woman appears and they get married within a month.
Right.
And she then becomes much, much more than a wife. I mean, she's somebody who's a big economic player. She's sort of involved in the banking sector and the maritime sector. Interestingly, when at the time of the Civil War, the European Union, we the UK don't have sanctions against her because, of course, she's still a British citizen. She's got 2 nationalities, but the EU put her under sanctions. Her specifically, as well as him, because she's actually a big player as well as being his wife.
Can I just sort of take it back? Because it's a fascinating question that we keep coming to when you're in government trying to analyze new regimes, and this question of whether you're going to be optimistic or pessimistic. So obviously now we know that the guy turned out to essentially become a sort of Russian oligarch gangster type. But if we take you back to 2000, so you're in Downing Street, you've been in there for 3 years, and this man comes in who's done a postgraduate degree in ophthalmology in London, is known as a kind of slightly geeky IT type. And there are a lot of, I remember at that period, very expatriate Syrian businessmen who cared deeply about their country, but were living abroad and who really hoped this would be a moment of reopening. And I remember going to Syria in 2003, 4, 5, 6, and seeing the country beginning to open up and investment coming in. And even as late as the beginning of 2010, I remember as a young MP being encouraged, would I go on visits to Syria, meet the Syrian embassy? He's much better than his father. Can we lift sanctions? And then the Arab Spring happens at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, so he starts slaughtering people. And of course, from the point of view of the Syrian businessman, who were encouraging this, a moment of incredible trauma and betrayal,
Mm.
where they thought, my goodness, I've been promoting for the last 6 years this man as a moderate, and now he's turned out to be an absolute monster. At which point they flip hard over and start saying he must be toppled at once, and get very angry with the British government for not intervening,
Yeah.
because Cameron doesn't get his vote through. Obama backs off in 2013 from his red lines. And then fast forward, Bashar is then in power. But let me take you back to this moment in 2000. Give us a sense of how you thought about it.
Well, of course, this is the great advantage, Rory, of having kept diaries, because when we talked about Assad the other day, Fiona, my partner, said, "Why didn't you talk about that lunch?" I said, "What lunch?" She said, "There was that time when they came to London, Mr. and Mrs. Bashar al-Assad, and you went off with Tony and al-Assad and Jonathan and David Manning and one or two others, and Cherie and I had lunch with Mrs. Asma Assad in the White Room." And I'll be honest, Rory, I had no memory of it. So this is why diaries are really, really useful. Anyway, so one of our meetings, in fact, we had a new word that we developed when we called Tony. If Tony got a really hard time from somebody, we'd say he was Bashared, because what happened was Tony once did this press conference with Bashar in Damascus,
Right.
October 2001.
Yep.
When and they basically agreed in the meeting that because of 9/11 and the Americans were under such pressure, and
Yep.
Bashar would sort of put his real deep anti-Americanism to one side, and he'd kind of say and do the right things.
Yep.
Instead of which, when we went out to face the media, he absolutely turned on Tony Blair, said that he was on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the argument, and all this. I'll never forget Tony afterwards saying, "I think it was just a cultural thing. I'm not sure he meant it." And of course, so thereafter we call that being Bashar. But there's a very interesting footnote in my diaries, because when I talk about the issue that we were addressing, the footnote says this. This is what he said at the press conference. After repeating Syrian condemnation of the September 11 attacks, Assad defended resistant fighters. He said, "Resistance to occupation is an international right. Nobody can deny we have many organizations, many people who support resistance fighters who seek to liberate their land." And I thought, reading that today, I mean, what goes around comes around. He, of course, was talking about the right of those who were under occupation by the Americans to fight against them.
It was an amazing moment, because the moment when you're meeting him, his father's died, and the Syrian constitution stated that you had to be a minimum of 40 to run for the presidency, and he was 34 years old.
Yeah.
So the constitution was changed overnight to say you had to be a minimum of 34. And he then, I think, got something like 97.29% of the vote.
Yeah, it wasn't close. It wasn't close.
Comes in. Now, when you read these diary entries, does it then spark a lot of other memories that are not in the diary, or is it still mostly the substance of the diary? Do you suddenly think, "Oh, wait a sec, I'd suddenly forgotten about all this other stuff"?
No, I do. It does spark stuff. So there's another meeting we had, and this I think was the dinner or the lunch that Fiona talked about, and Fiona's got a better memory than I have. She remembers Mrs. Assad as being a kind of wannabe Queen Rania, Queen Rania of Jordan, who's kind of amazingly glamorous and very clever, and also I think got a pretty good heart. And Asma Assad couldn't quite put it off. But no, I remember. It's funny you mentioned IT, because in one of the meetings, I actually recorded in the diary that it was a bit dull.
Right.
And that he and the minister that he was with kept wanting to tell us about how great their IT systems were.
Right.
So, but equally, to go back to the serious point you were making about how do you operate with these people that you're trying to push in a certain direction, and of course, Putin is the most obvious example of where we got any sort of optimism wrong, or at least certainly it didn't. It wasn't sort of backed up by history. But with Assad, I record in the diary, we got a really good press for how we handled Assad. I don't remember this at all, but I wrote for Tony an article in the Syrian press about the importance of us having, good relations and working together and settling differences peacefully and all this sort of stuff. So you have to kind of, I guess, go through the motions, and also there's some
Well,
amazing.
not just go through the motions. You may even be
No, you're trying to do it.
more
You're
hopeful.
trying to
You're
do it.
gambling.
Absolutely.
You're hoping
Absolutely.
that it's a new person. He's younger.
Yeah.
He's more Western, more British.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, he's going to be a Gorbachev figure. Maybe he's going to lead the reform. And as I say, people kept believing that for years afterwards. There was this optimism. You know, I had a friend in the in the embassy in Damascus, and I went to stay with them in these kind of height years. And my godson was baptized in a little church in Syria. And again, at that period, still there was so much hope that maybe now. Meanwhile, we've also got David McCluskey, who now does The Rest is Classified, who we were talking to when we were last week, who was a CIA analyst on the ground in Damascus in the latter period. Of course, reporting on regime prisons, on torturers, on horrible allegations, not just allegations, reality of rape. And then after the event, the revelations of well, in fact, maybe I'll sort of selfishly kind of fast forward a little bit to my experience engaging with them after the Arab Spring. So I was very close to Simon Collis, who was our ambassador in Damascus when the whole regime collapsed. And Simon and I had been in Basra together, and I went to see him in Qatar, and he speaks very, very good Arabic, and one of the best Arabists in the Foreign Office. And I think Simon won't mind me saying
Arabic speaker, Rory, not
Arabic speaker.
Arabic speaker.
Arabic speaker.
Oh, you sort of the Foreign Office coming through you there, I'm afraid.
Coming through. I hope he won't mind me saying. I mean, I've just been talking to him again over the last 2-3 days a great deal, because he's following this unbelievably closely and is so well informed on these different groups and where they're going. But I hope he won't mind me saying that there was a moment when he was relatively optimistic that the Bashar al-Assad regime wouldn't last very long. You know, he was able to point out that the regime seemed pretty rotten, that they didn't really know how to do counterinsurgency. They were killing a lot of people. And there was this huge opposition against them, which wasn't just Islamist groups in those days, was moderates. And of course, 5 million people fleeing the country, many of whom have ended up in Germany, and some of whom have ended up in Britain, etc. And of course, most dramatically of all, disrupting the whole region, Jordan ended up taking 1 million refugees. Lebanon ended up taking 1 million refugees. Turkey ended up taking 2 million refugees or 3 million refugees. Then I'm the minister. So by 2016, I was the international development minister responsible for the Middle East, and I was being sent submissions from the civil service to send money to these Syrian opposition groups around Idlib up in the northwest. And I was beginning to get very, very concerned that the liberals were disappearing and that a bunch of al-Qaeda affiliates were taking over the show. Our embassy, which by then had moved to Turkey, pushed back against me and said, no, there still are secular liberal elements. Don't underestimate these town councils that you're funding. But the corruption was unbelievable. So, you know, I found us at one point buying a electricity generator for a hospital, which it turned out the doctors had stolen the day before from the hospital and sold back to us to power the hospital, right? And you would turn up, you know, or you'd look into these meetings and you'd see these very shadowy figures with their faces covered and guns standing in the background. It reminded me a lot of the stuff that I'd seen in Iraq and the way in which militia groups can take over. So I tried very hard to stop the funding, didn't get very far, got into a huge argument with special forces, Whitehall, America, until eventually one of the teachers we were funding appeared on a stage with al-Qaeda, at which point the funding stopped. Now, these are the groups that
just on that, Rory, did that include Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
Absolutely. Right.
When were
they were then largely called Jabhat al-Nusra.
Right.
But the father group of HTS was absolutely the center of this whole story. And HTS is the group that's taken over that area that we, the British government, were funding. And so this is then the problem, right?
So when did we prescribe them? When did the British government prescribe HTS? Because they are prescribed, aren't they?
Yeah. But definitely, because the
Organisation.
exact I'm going to get the exact date wrong on a live YouTube, which I don't want to do. But we put a $10 million bounty on his head, and to put that in context, that is only for the very, very top terrorist leaders, right? You don't get a $10 million bounty easily, right?
This is for July. This is for Gilani,
For
the leader.
Gilani himself, right?
Yeah.
Because Gilani himself had gone to fight in Iraq.
Yeah.
And was associated with what we call, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh.
And he got jailed there. He was in jail.
Absolutely. So he was a proper foreign fighter going from Syria into Iraq, comes back. But this is something I want to get onto, which is that one of the problems is that when you label something a terrorist group in government, there are lots of reasons why that's a bit dangerous in terms of continuing to take curiosity and how they might be changing. So let's say, for the sake of argument, HTS is a very different group to the group that existed in 2016, and that he's a very different man from the guy that went out to fight in Iraq. He certainly claims so. Why didn't we pick that up? And part of the problem is that if you label something as a terrorist group, you run into problems even in talking to them. The US Department of Justice will sanction you if you get too close to these groups. It was the same. I mean, if I really make this more spicy for the live show, it was the same issue with Hamas and Hezbollah. And it was the same, and I'm going to bring you to this on the IRA. When do these groups transition from being terrorist groups in a narrow sense, i.e. a small group of people killing civilians in order to terrorize the population? When do they transition into becoming a political movement?
Well,
so with Hamas, potentially, that's when they stand for election in 2006. Hezbollah, when they start entering the Lebanese government. HTS, when they take over a regime. Taliban, when they take over Afghanistan. Now, let me just come back to you then, because one of the key questions now that he's dealing with is very close to the questions you dealt with in Northern Ireland on Good Friday. What do you do with a society where people have been killing, hundreds, 400,000 people on either side, where families are pitted against each other, where the destruction is unbelievable, the resentment is unbelievable, the suspicion is unbelievable, and where the leader of the organization is himself intimately and directly connected with terrorism? Over to you.
I think you have to, well, particularly now that Gilani is the leader of this organization, well, the leader of the biggest organization involved in all the organizations that have performed this toppling of the Assad regime, which is an incredible achievement when you think about it. Whatever you think about who and what they are, to have done this in such a small time and to move so far and so fast is pretty amazing. But you now have to talk to them. There's no doubt about that. And that does mean you do one of two things. You either keep them as a prescribed organization, but you have little sort of conversations under the radar, as John Major did with the IRA, and John Major's government did with the IRA, and then we did for a while as well, and then eventually brought them, as it were, into the tent. Or you unprescribe them. And I suspect that is probably what those governments who have prescribed them will end up doing, because this is both a moment of real danger for that country and for the region, but also it's a kind of moment of hope as well. And the question then is, how do you build on that hope? And I think it's very, very interesting to watch the way these guys have been behaving. So they've gone from Idlib, and then they did Aleppo, then they did Hama, and now they're in Damascus. And along the way, I mean, look, they've been fighting, right? They have been fighting, they've been killing people, but it's quite clear that the Syrian forces have been kind of melting away a lot of the time. You've then had the Russians have sort of come in and done a bit of kind of fighting back on behalf of Assad, but not very much. I'll tell you in a minute about Lavrov. I watched a thing with Lavrov yesterday, which is very interesting. So they're now there. And do you know what really got my kind of antennae twitching? There was, just as the news broke that Assad had left, he'd fled the country, there was a very short video clip posted by the prime minister. So you've got the president, Assad, he's the dictator in charge, and then he's got his kind of little puppet government, as it were. And the prime minister was on video essentially saying, what basically saying, I'm really paraphrasing now, but look, the rebels have toppled our lot. Therefore, they're going to be the government, and we're going to make sure there's a kind of, nice, smooth, peaceful transition sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the next thing, you see him being brought out of a building, out of a government building, and being escorted very politely by these guys with guns to the Four Seasons Hotel.
Yeah, where I used to stay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he's there, based there, sort of helping this transition. I guess the other thing we should think about, Rory, is who are the players now in this? Because you've got America, who always can be a big player, and all you've got from the White House is Joe Biden is being briefed and watching it closely. You have got Donald Trump, who was in Paris last night and did a post on Truth Social saying, "This is none of our business. Stay out of Syria. It's a mess, but it's not our problem." I think the big player in this, it potentially could be Turkey. Because Turkey, we don't talk enough about Turkey on the podcast, actually, because it is such an important country. But I think in this, because of their historic role, because of their current role in what's going on now, I wonder if they are the force that's going to try and create some sort of cohesion between these opposition groups.
So you're completely right. So this is also complicated that I didn't properly get into this in the explainer, but the reason why Bashar al-Assad survived was because of Iran and Russia. And Russia basically provided the air force, and Iran had this militia group, Hezbollah, coming from Lebanon, that provided the infantry. And Hezbollah has been hit very, very hard by Israel, which is the pager attacks, the radio attacks, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. And so has the IRGC, which is the Revolutionary Guard commanders from Iran, who actually works on the ground with Hezbollah. And Russia's been distracted by Ukraine. So what we've seen is, as these groups have advanced, the assumption was that the regime would at least try to hold Hama, Homs, and Damascus.
Yeah.
And there were Russian planes still there. But it's all collapsed like a pack of cards. And it's turned out that even the inner circle of the presidential bodyguard that you used to see strutting around the streets next to the British Embassy in their smart suits, who are Alawites, also don't seem to have really fought. And the Russians appear to have evacuated both their naval base and their air base.
Yeah.
And this makes a lot of difference, because the naval base is what the Russians used to supply the Wagner mercenaries in Africa. Now, one of the questions is, so Trump's view on this, and Trump's tweet is absolutely astonishing. He seems to be really thinking about Russia's interests here. So he says, and he's actually quite sort of, it's quite sort of insightful analysis by Trump, very unusual from a presidential candidate. He says, Russia, because they're so tied up in Ukraine, seem incapable of stopping this literal march through Syria, a country they've protected for years. Now they're like possibly Assad himself being forced out. It may actually be the best thing that can happen to Russia. There was never much of a benefit in Syria for Russia other than to make Obama look really stupid. Right. Now, so he could be right about that.
You missed the bit there, Rory, where he said, "This is where former President Obama refused to honor his commitment to protecting the red line in the sand, and all hell broke out with Russia stepping in." Very rarely that I agree with the point that Donald Trump makes, but I agree with that point.
You do agree with that. And then he goes on to say, we'll get to this in a second, in any event, Syria's a mess, but it's not our friend. And then in caps, you know how he does caps.
Yeah.
The United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. And of course, 25,000 replies, 60,000 retweets, 350,000 likes, 66 million views.
Wow.
Right. And that's just on Twitter. So
no, that's Truth Social, isn't it?
No, that's Twitter. That's Twitter. I'm reading.
Okay.
It's the same tweet, doubtless, the same post, doubtless. But this is 66 million
Wow.
views on Twitter alone. I don't know what you're getting on Truth Social.
Wow. I don't know. 13 million.
13 million.
1.3. Sorry.
1.3. So then the question is, what do other people do? And as you've mentioned, Turkey really matters here. Although Turkey apparently are angry with the HTS because clearly the HTS haven't been doing what the Turks wanted, and they've allowed the Kurds to advance, and the Turks are very frightened about the Kurds because the Kurds are a major opposition group in southern Turkey. The Turks the Russians and the Iranians were the key players in the peace process in Astana, which was one of the great moments that seemed to stabilize Bashar al-Assad's regime. That was very unpopular with the region because the joke that was made was that it was the Shah, the Tsar, and the Sultan sitting together. In other words, these three great 19th century powers were sitting down around a table. This time, there's talk of a much broader group of people that could include Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, Iraq, getting involved in the conversation along with Turkey. UAE has been a bit, so UAE, to remind people, is obviously Dubai, Abu Dhabi, very familiar to many British people, the home of Emirates Airlines, actually was supporting Bashar al-Assad. So they had decided, largely, they thought they were being realistic. He wasn't going anywhere. So he began attending meetings of the Arab League, and UAE, in fact, as these groups advanced, made supportive comments behind Bashar al-Assad and critical of HTS. They've now gone a bit silent, and I notice they're not being discussed at the moment as being one of the players in a possible roundtable. But that may change too.
And what do you think? What do you reckon on Russia? Because I watched this. There's this huge conference going on in Doha at the moment, a kind of big foreign policy shindig. Which
and another shindig in Manama in Bahrain. There's a lot of Gulf shindigs with a lot of people talking. Yeah.
I kind of wish I was actually invited to the shindig in Qatar, and I kind of wish I'd gone there because Lavrov did this very long on-stage interview with the diplomatic editor of Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera broadcast it live, and this was yesterday when it was still very unclear what was happening. And the guy doing the interview, he did a very good job because Lavrov's quite a difficult character and he's very tetchy and he does all that sort of quite snarly, quite nasty sort of style with journalists when they ask him difficult questions. But the guy just kept pressing away. But I got without being able to give you the words that he said that made me think this, but I got a real sense of distancing. There was from Assad. And I wondered whether, I now wonder whether Lavrov already knew what was happening. Because he essentially was saying, look, we've supported the Syrians because we support those who are being subjected to American hegemony, and he sort of flipped it all about America's trying to rule the world, and those who don't want America to rule the world, we'll kind of support them. And then when the guy said to him, why have you it's quite a big thing, isn't it? You've instructed Russian citizens to leave Syria. And he got very, very tetchy and sort of pushed back and said, this is kind of, not important and it's not significant. And it was a very, very odd little interview. Well, it was a very long interview. But so I just felt I just sensed there was something going on that he knew more than we did.
So I've got a good friend.
So they've pulled the plug. They've effectively pulled the plug.
They've pulled the plug. They've pulled the plug. And it's quite interesting because I don't know what it will mean for their reputation. So there were lots of Gulf states who said that when the US and its allies left Afghanistan, that was a real sign of our incredible weakness and that we were losing the plot. And a lot of those same states were very impressed by Putin saving Bashar al-Assad and showing that he could thumb a nose at the West. Even though they disagreed with Bashar al-Assad and Russia, they were sort of won over by that. I wonder whether they're going to be able to get away with taking the Trump line, which is, well, it was never in our interests anyway, we should never have been there, and leave, or whether it does dent their reputation. Because the other thing that's dented Russia's reputation is that it was they that sold the air defenses to Iran, which completely failed to deal with the Israeli missiles. So if you're sitting there in the Gulf looking at Russia at the moment, you may think, wait a second, their tech isn't quite as good. They were pretty incompetent in getting to Kiev. They've abandoned Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Maybe this isn't really the sort of regime that Putin's trying to project. Maybe it's the sort of strange, funny, dysfunctional gangster state that proves to be surprisingly resilient and unpredictable, but not really someone you want to ally with. Listen, just on these things that you're talking about, Doha Forum and Manama Dialogues, both going on at the moment, both of which I'm sure you've been to, and I've been to a number of times. And they're a sort of amazing gathering of people like Lavrov, but also all the kind of foreign policy thinkers from Washington and everyone turn up in London and hold forth on. So I was just talking to someone there who is a former very senior British diplomat and who knows Syria very well. He's incredibly funny about it, because what you're getting in both places at the moment is what he calls the kind of Georgetown jargon, which is everybody saying, we need a regional, local, and international security architecture and a renewed commitment to the rules-based international order. And he's just like, wait, none of that
Good luck
remotely
with that.
exactly describes the reality of this person. Have you had a chance to see, talking about amazing journalism, have you had a chance to see the CNN interview with Jelani?
No.
Oh, unbelievable. So we'll put it in the if somebody's really
when did you see it?
It went up yesterday.
Okay.
And it's on.
I spent most of yesterday watching the Notre Dame stuff, which was absolutely breathtaking. It was breathtaking.
We'll get into that. And maybe if somebody's really clever, on one of our producers could put the link to the thing in the chat, or maybe in some after event. Anyway, it's an interview 9.5 minutes long, where the CNN interviewer keeps saying, listen, there are a lot of people very worried about you. And he's sitting there in full military fatigues with his big beard on an armchair. He's on the outskirts of Hama. He's still a long way from Damascus. And they keep saying, how can we possibly believe that you've changed? You got a price in your head. You were connected to Al-Qaeda. You're connected to ISIS. And he is extraordinary. And this is what we don't know. To what extent is this bluff? To what extent has he changed? But my goodness, the communication is impressive. So if you ignore his past and the military fatigues and the big beard, there's very, very little conversation about Islam. She asks him straight out, religion, and he says, listen, there have been many, many sects in Syria for hundreds of years, and we are here to respect them. And we need to create a legal framework that protects the rights of all minorities. And then she says...
The interview, as if by magic, has just got in the chat, Rory.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Then she says, how about HTS? Is it gonna dominate everything? He says, HTS is just one detail. It's a means to an end. It will probably dissolve. The end is creating, and then he again refers to this idea of this kind of rules-based, minority-protecting, autonomous system. And he says, when she pushes him on his past, I'll finish with this. He says, someone who clings too rigidly to their identity cannot possibly navigate the complex situations of the modern world.
I mean, you were making the comparisons with the IRA. Do you think this is the sort of Jerry Adams approach to peace building? Do you think he's somebody who's gone from one mode to another? It's very interesting to watch how he's behaved since they've got to Damascus. He's put out a statement saying that it is forbidden, so that's a sort of strong leadership word, forbidden for military forces in the city to approach any public institutions. These institutions will remain under the supervision of the former prime minister until they are officially handed over, which says to me he's done a deal with this guy.
You
know, and so no, he's actually kind of from a middle class background. He's very well educated. He's very urbane. Tell me how he spoke, Rory, because I hear that he's got a very kind of soft sort of voice, and I'm a big believer in the importance of voice in politics. That he's quite soft spoken. Is that right?
He is soft spoken. The interview is in Arabic, and it's dubbed in the way that our interview with Angela Merkel coming out tomorrow is dubbed.
Right.
But I've been talking to people who've been listening to his other interviews that he's done in Arabic, and they say it's very consistent. I mean, there's a sense of his own sort of Georgetown jargon around means and ends and structures and things. Should we quickly, as we move towards the end, see if we can get some sensible questions from the comments, which don't include Air saying the carpet on Rory's wall makes it look like he's recording on the ceiling. That's a carpet I bought in Tehran, if anybody's interested in the carpet. Okay, let's try to see this. Okay, people saying Jelani was released. Okay, Mrs. H, is this really going to be bad for Putin? I always think he's one chess move ahead of everyone else.
Well, Garry Kasparov, who is one of the greatest chess players of all time, who I interviewed about Putin for my book Winners, he said Putin is not a chess player; he's a poker player. And that's Garry Kasparov's way of saying that chess players are a lot cleverer than Putin. So listen, I think Putin will be, I think the Iranians will be worried about this as well, because this presumably is the sort of thing that they fear. I mean, Putin, we never really know how much real support Putin has, but we kind of have always known that a lot of Syrians hate Assad, and we also know that a lot of Iranians hate their own regime, but they can't say so.
Yeah, so this is devastating for Iran. They have lost their main proxy, Hezbollah. They've been proved that they can't respond to Israeli attacks. Their senior IRGC leadership has been killed. The Iranian people are very angry with them. Who knows what support they've got left? 5-10% of the population, 90% of people are against them. So it's quite possible that this regime in Iran could collapse. And that would be, the biggest news in the Middle East for 50 years, really. But the reason it could collapse is all these regimes turn out to be much more fragile than we think.
Yeah.
Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad. In fact, our own regime in Kabul, the regime that the US and the UK was backing, collapsed like a house of cards in a few days. The only reason to be cautious on Iran is we've been wrong so often. I mean, for optimism bias, people have predicted again and again the Iranian regime collapsing, and it may be that there are elements of resilience and statehood and national structures in Iran that don't exist in these other places.
Putin has not been very visible in the last couple of weeks. But listen, in terms of Putin likes to project himself as a winner. To go back to Donald Trump's Truth Social and Barack Obama not following through on his red lines about chemical weapons when Assad used them against his own people, I do think that was the moment when Putin thought, these guys are weaker than even I thought, I'm going to go for this. And he is now, in this regard, been seen to have lost. He has lost in Syria because, and that was the sort of, I think, the reason for the tetchiness that Lavrov was showing yesterday. And yes, we can say it's because he's distracted from Ukraine, distracted with what's going on in Ukraine. But the truth is he has lost in this and will now be looking to see how he can pull back from it. Who do you think the winners and the losers are in this, Rory? If you go,
this question from Cameron that he said does Israel win from this? And
well,
yeah, let me try very quickly on Israel, and then over to you for what you think on Israel. So I think Israel's going to have two views on this. On the one hand, Israel will feel that their actions against Iran and Hezbollah has managed to topple this regime. And there's a huge advantage to what's happened, which is that it effectively cuts Hezbollah in Lebanon off from Iran. Iran was previously had a massive highway, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, to get supplies through. They can provide money now to Hezbollah in Lebanon, but they won't be able to provide weapons in the same way. So Israel will be happy about that. On the other hand, the Assad regime, for longer than my lifetime, while talking a good game against Israel, in practice have cooperated with the Israeli border and with the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. And an Islamist group has just taken over in Syria, which sounds more moderate, doesn't sound like it's got international ambitions, but will have some people in Israel worried. Over to you.
I totally agree with that. I think that on the one hand, Assad, to some extent, suited Israel because they didn't really see him as much as a threat. He tended to kind of leave them alone when they went after Iranian targets inside Syria. But if you do get a much more radical Syrian government, then it's hard to see that they wouldn't be much more active in relation to going after Israel over Gaza, for example. So I think Israel is both a winner and a loser. I think the clear losers are Russia and Iran, and I think Turkey probably is feeling that this has empowered them a little bit more.
Yeah, and another question, Helena B, not a huge advantage for the Palestinians, though, is it? And I think that's probably right. I think the likelihood, I mean, again, look, all this stuff is unbelievably uncertain. Do remember, I mean, I think we keep saying this in the podcast, but maybe this is the most dramatic example that we've seen in the lifetime of the podcast, how impossible it is for even deep experts on the region to predict these things. You may get one or two of them predicting it, but even Hassan, who's the most amazing Syria analyst, what he's pointing to is predictions he made, I think, in 2016. So he called it right, but it happened 8 years after he called it. Maybe it's a bit unfair to him, but the basic point is that we really struggled to know that this was going to happen. And certainly I do not know anyone who thought that Damascus would fall within just over a week.
No.
And it was the same. I've talked to you about this, talking to the former head of British intelligence and the US National Security Advisor in January 2022, saying Putin's never going to attack Kiev. And he then attacked Kiev. So massive pinch of salt. But there is good reason to think that this Islamist regime in Syria is likely not to want to alienate its neighbors by having too aggressive a foreign policy. It will want to concentrate on trying to stabilize, and it doesn't want sanctions. There have been tens of billions of damage to the Syrian economy, and they're going to have to get investment in. So it may be that, to answer that question on Palestinians, it's not going down. The other one we haven't mentioned much is Lebanon. Lebanon has been, at least for 20 years, probably 30 years, totally overshadowed by Syria. Essentially, if Syria blinks, Lebanon weeps, and there's now a new regime in. And this is going to affect who the new president in Lebanon will turn out to be, whether this new regime in Lebanon is going to provide room for Hezbollah or not. So that's the next place to look at, almost before Iran, is to look at Lebanon.
There's massive activity on the Lebanese border because, of course, lots of Syrians now think they can come back. Some of those refugees that you were talking about. I think the other thing that's maybe just worth reflecting on a little bit is just to go back to the point about Trump and also about Europe. It's interesting in our discussions, we've essentially been saying, well, the Americans don't want to get too involved. And we haven't really mentioned Europe at all. I've seen statements from Macron and Scholz saying we should be celebrating this. I've not seen much from the British government yet. But I just wonder whether it is a sort of sign of a kind of new, not diplomatic force, but new forces and groupings. Because the other thing we haven't mentioned is the United Nations. And now the United Nations, actually, you could argue this is kind of sort of tailor-made for them to kind of go in and say, well, let's see if we can be the broker.
Yeah, this is a huge opportunity. I mean, it is a huge opportunity because Trump has made it clear that he wants to have nothing to do with it. And therefore, it is a very interesting opportunity to see whether the UN and the EU and the UK and the region are going to step up and try to make the most of this. And I think that's really important because what happened in Sudan is basically a military regime was toppled, civilian government took over. We were very, very unimaginative, ungenerous, and slow to provide support, and it's collapsed into civil war.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty confident that if we do nothing to provide any support to Syria, the whole thing is going to collapse into mayhem again. So logically, what the UK, Europe, Middle East, and UN should be doing is trying to provide some assistance in the hope that Syria goes on a slightly better path and not on a worse path. And all this stuff will be familiar to most people listening. He's got to demobilize militia groups. He's got to write a constitution that gets a very difficult balance between keeping the country unified and also protecting minorities, right? So there's going to be this huge debate about, oh my goodness, we don't want Balkanization, we don't want Lebanization, which is the Arabic equivalent, which is where you enshrine sectarian divisions by giving people fixed political roles. That's your whole Good Friday question, right?
Yeah.
But other people saying, but if we create a single unified majority government, these minorities are going to be screwed. So he'll have to do all that. And then he's got to get the economy going. He's got to perform. He's got to create jobs. This is a mini version of what Gaza's going to face if Israel ever disengages from Gaza. I mean, how do you rebuild a country that's been stuck in a state of civil war and sanctions since 2011?
I'm going to read out this question, Rory, from John Dunn. I think John Dunn must have watched me on Question Time with Nigel Farage. His question is, was Brexit to blame for this? And here you are, John. This is going to surprise you. No, Brexit is not to blame for this. Okay? There we are. There we go. Well, listen, Rory, that's very good to talk to you about that. I'm glad that we've been able to... Anything else you want to tell our dear listeners?
Well, no. I think James versus the Commonwealth had a good question. What sort of system of government do you think would work to stabilize Syria, federal, non-federal, parliamentary, unitary, etc.? But that'll be really central to the way he's thinking. And the interesting thing about Jelani is he is very interested in those sort of questions.
Well, and also that's where whether it is the Turks or whether it is some kind of international gathering, those are the questions that now flow from this. I suppose if just to sort of go back to the IRA, I noticed that the Al Qaeda put out a statement, really horrible, sort of saying now is the time to go out and kill all Jews and Crusaders. Now that is obviously, that feels to me a little bit like I'm really, as you know, Rory, I'm incredibly fond of the Irish. So I hesitate to make some of these comparisons.
Yeah.
But a little bit like when Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness finally decided they were going to pursue this kind of peaceful political path, there was this opposition that sort of became called themselves the real IRA.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing so those sort of things are now going to happen. And of course, we're talking about a region where the killing and the mayhem is, even worse than we saw in Ireland.
And it will happen more and more. And what the risk of it, and this was true when there were some moderates in Hamas trying to talk, and of course they were immediately undermined by extremists making genocidal comments about Israel. And that then means that you can very easily discredit these groups, and it's a really difficult bit of judgment.
Yeah.
Has the group changed? Is it still really a terrorist group? So I guess there would have been people saying to you in Northern Ireland, nah, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness haven't changed. They're still the same group. And there's So anyway, you're right to alert us to that, because that'll come back again and again.
And maybe we should close on this one because it sort of relates to something we were saying earlier. John Davis, Assad was defeated by a patchwork of different forces. What are the chances they'll fight each other for power in another civil war? And that, of course, can lead anywhere, including to the breakup of the country. So I think people are right to be. I think we should celebrate the fact that this awful regime is gone, but we shouldn't underestimate how difficult and dangerous this is going to be for a while.
Very difficult, dangerous, different to the Taliban, where there weren't a collection of 4 different armed groups coming in. It was basically just the Taliban, so it was easier for them to set up power.
Yeah.
And the questions. The Taliban's a good analogy, because it may well be that this regime is more liberal at the beginning and then a year or two in begins to get more conservative, begins to do stuff on women, which can become very, very disturbing. And then the West is going to have to ask itself how it prices stability against human rights. And so I think many of these things still to think, but it is true at the moment that this is one of the rare moments of optimism in Damascus. Let me just finish with that. Very, very interesting how many people celebrating are not from the Sunni Islamist groups.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Druze celebrating and tearing down statues of Assad. You've got Christian groups coming out. You've got a sense at the moment that they're sticking to their word, that they're not going after the minorities, that their troops are well disciplined and well behaved. Unfortunately, there were moments of optimism in Damascus in 1918 and 1946.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Good. And a final reminder to listeners that on Leading tomorrow, we have, I think, one of our best interviews to date with Angela Merkel. I thought it was, I listened back to it yesterday, Rory. It was really, really good. And I think she was really open and quite funny. And just, I found the whole thing, very insightful, very frank about herself, I thought. So I think if people are interested in Angela Merkel, they will enjoy Leading tomorrow.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alastair. Bye-bye.